What is Siemens PCB Flow offering and why does it matter? Let's talk about that next. Here recently, Siemens, and specifically the Valor group within Siemens, has come out with a new solution called PCB Flow. And it really is targeted at design for manufacturing assessments for electronic boards earlier in the product development process. Now, to really understand kind of why this solution can add value, it's kind of important to understand when engineers typically assess manufacturability of boards and why it's important to shift it earlier in the development process. So here's the way it typically works. You have an engineer that's developed a board and they're basically ready to source that board out. And no board is really single sourced anymore. It's more unusual. So what happens is that engineer shares this board definition out to a number of different suppliers. And they assess that board against their kind of best practices and rules, basically design rule checks for manufacturability. And they provide that feedback to the engineer. And then that identifies a number of manufacturability issues. Some that can vary from supplier to supplier. You know, one supplier might identify one issue, another one might be okay with it. So this usually happens late in the design process, and that causes issues. So let's take a second to talk about those issues. You know, when you have big changes at the end of the product development process, usually the designs are so constrained that you have little flexibility to accommodate, bigger changes. And that means you got to make other compromises in other spaces. So it can be a nasty problem that you run into. But, on the other hand, this causes delays in the product development process. There are a lot of companies under tight time constraints that are trying to hit a certain window to go to market or to deliver these things to their clients. So this has become a significant problem. So the change that a lot of companies are pursuing is to do these design for manufacturability tests far earlier in the development process, so you can avoid all that chaos at the end. And the way that a lot of companies have been doing this is the suppliers will take their checks, this long list of things that they look for, these characteristics on the board, and they will share those with, the company that's designing the board. And as a result, the engineer can then identify, okay, there's an issue here, there's an issue here, and here. But there's a few problems on this front. For one, the competition is fierce between these contract manufacturers that have all these design rule checks, right? So they're a little concerned that, the company that is designing the OEM, designing the board, is going to take those and directly or indirectly share it with their competitors. So the design rule checks that they hand over to OEMs typically are not the full story, right? Because they don't want to hand over all of their IP, all the design rule checks that describe how they manufacture boards and the lessons learned that they've captured over the years. So as a result, these engineers are working against a list that is incomplete, maybe a little bit off, and you still run into this issue at the end where they hand the design over to the contract manufacturer and they say, hey, you still have an issue here. They're not avoiding the end of product development issues that cause them to go off and do this DFM analysis to begin with. So this is where this solution from Siemens called PCB Flow comes into play. So instead of the contract manufacturers sharing all of their checks with the OEM, they instead share it to this intermediary, this cloud solution that then synchronizes with the ECAD tool that the design engineer is using to develop the board. And then in aggregate, all of those rules can be used as checks, manufacturability checks, for the board that's being developed. So this adds some protection of the intellectual property for contract manufacturers. So those are the capabilities that PCB Flow delivers, and if you look at it from an engineer, it allows them to perform these DFM checks early on and avoid these late stage delays with the schedule or ugly design compromises. From a contract manufacturer perspective, it protects their intellectual property, but still lets them kind of participate and give insight to engineers designing the boards so that you can also avoid these late stage design issues. Interestingly enough, the solution is a cloud-based solution. It acts as the intermediary between contract manufacturers and design engineers. So that is PCB Flow from the Valor group within Siemens. And that's it. Take care. Talk soon.